Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Our webinar will begin shortly. Hello again and welcome. Thanks for joining us for today's discussion on welcoming faculty and students back. I'm Carmen Makarashvili. I'm an academic strategy consultant at ACUE, and today we are here to help prepare you to welcome your faculty and students back to class for a new year and a new semester. A little housekeeping, please note that there is a question and answer function at the bottom of your screen. Please use this function to submit your questions as we work through today's session. If you notice that there's a question from someone else that was also on your mind, please like that question and it will move up the queue. I would also like to bring your attention to the resources that accompany this webinar, including our toolkit that can be found on our web page. A lot of great resources there. Please check it out. Now, it is my honor to introduce David Braylow from the Council of Independent Colleges to help frame the conversation. Welcome, David. David, please unmute.
Well, let's try that again, shall we? Thank you, Carmen. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Braylow, Vice President for Development at the Council of Independent Colleges. CIC is delighted to co-sponsor with our friends at ACUE this ACUE webinar on meeting students where they are. We have all been through 18 months, although probably feels like years to most of us, of some of the toughest challenges ever faced by our member colleges and universities, and especially by their students. Organizations like ours and like ACUE have worked hard to provide programs that can help institutions serve their students in the midst of crisis. CIC focuses on developing and supporting campus leaders, advancing institutional excellence, and enhancing public understanding of independent higher education. In all that we do, we always have foremost in our minds that our member institutions exist to transform and enrich the lives of students and prepare them to contribute in meaningful ways to the common good. The pandemic has had a drastic impact on all students and has disproportionately affected those from our most vulnerable populations. ACUE has responded by creating a series of practical and relevant webinars to help faculty members and campus leaders address these issues as they welcome students back this fall. CIC has been proud to partner with ACUE and admires its research-based approach and reliance on experts like today's panelists who can speak authoritatively to best pedagogical practices. We welcome all of you to this webinar and wish you every success as you begin a new academic year.
Thank you, David. I'm excited for today's conversation on meeting students where they are. Now, I would like to welcome our panelists to the screen. Dr. Santiba Campbell, Associate Professor of Psychology, Faculty Senate President, ex-officio member of the Board of Trustees, and Director of Academic Special Initiatives at Bennett College. Welcome, Santiba. Dr. Edward Hill, Interim Provost and Accreditation Liaison at Harris-Stowe State University. Welcome, Edward. And Dr. Terry Paolo, Vice Provost of e-Learning at Dallas College. Welcome, Terry. Now, during the conversation today, we welcome your questions. Remember to use the Q&A function, and we will do our best to answer them throughout the conversation. So let's start with the first question with the title of today's discussion. What does it mean to meet students where they are? Specifically, how do you do that within the communities and students your institutions serve? Let's start with Terry.
Thank you very much. I think it's really good question, and welcome everyone. I think one of the things about that question about meeting students where they are now is part of the pandemic, and our response to the pandemic has been really needing to understand where our students are. Here in Dallas, in Texas, we've had many changes through the pandemic, but also as a geography, we're changing. We're one of the growing urban sprawls of the US. We have lots of people moving to Dallas. And the other thing during the pandemic, and I'm sure this is true of other spaces, urban spaces and non-urban spaces as well, we had influx into the area and people exiting the area as well during the pandemic. So Dallas College now finds itself kind of adapting to another academic year. Our students, about 25 to 30% of those students are dual enrollment students, so they're younger. A number of those students are exploring new career pathways because maybe they've been career displaced or looking to upskill because of a response to the pandemic. And so those things are kind of mediating our response to the community. But the other thing as well is, being a large urban area, we're also one of the most deprived and diverse areas within the US. And so that's also something we're cognizant of as an institution as we think about how we meet students where they are now. So how we get there, how we get to meet where the students are, we're spending an awful lot of time talking to students, learning about their circumstance, hearing about it. And we're doing that across the institution. I think there's a lot of kudos to be paid to our faculty as they've taken the time beyond instruction to really get to know and help their students during the last 18 months in ways we've probably never seen before.
Thank you, Terry. And Santiba, how are you addressing this question in your particular situation?
So good evening, everyone, and thanks for having me on the webinar today. I'm coming to you all from Bennett College. So we are a micro college in North Carolina, but interestingly enough, we sit in between two very large public institutions. So that in itself creates a different dynamic for us to meet our students where they are. Bennett College is also a historically Black college for women. So we're one of two in the nation. So that adds another dynamic to it, where in the midst of us continuing on through this pandemic, bringing our students back to campus has been a bit of a challenge. So you can imagine, as a micro college, it's only going to take a couple of cases for us to seriously consider the safety of our bells and the importance of the vaccine, because we've had additional considerations on our campus since, as a women's college, our students have had questions about, will it impact my fertility, or I'm currently pregnant, or I'm currently breastfeeding, so I don't want to get the vaccine. And as a private institution, we are requiring our students to have it. So one of the things that we're trying to figure out are hybrid and tech-enabled modalities of instruction, so that way our students can continue on their educational journey by being respectful of their bodies and some of the life choices that they are trying to make. Because you can imagine, like I said, being in the center of two very large public institutions, we have to be cognizant of their health and how that's going to impact. And another thing that we're also thinking about on our campus is not just the impact of student health, but also on faculty and staff. So as employees of the institution, a lot of us didn't even take a summer off because we've been, constantly watching the pandemic, checking in on our students, and also getting ready for this preparation. I mean, something interesting to think about is we have a sophomore class at our institution that has never been on campus. So last year's freshwomen are excited to come back to the yard, as we like to call it. However, they're full of anxiety. So I'm constantly receiving emails or different questions of what it's going to be like for them. So imagine coming back to college in the midst of a pandemic, but also being in your second year of college, but this is the first time you've actually seen the physical campus, while also being the faculty and staff that are here to support the angst of that, technically new student, but also maintaining your own well-being. So one of the ways of meeting the students where they are, you also have to meet the faculty and staff where they are too.
Thank you for pointing that out. We're all still adjusting as we continue with this pandemic. It's not over yet. And Edward, will you please tell us how you are adjusting within the communities and students that your institution serves?
Yes, good afternoon to everyone. Much like what has already been said, Harris-Stowe State University is an HBCU, the only one here in Missouri. So we're housed between two major research institutions, St. Louis University and WashU. So we're right in the middle. We're an access institution. So again, dealing with first generation students that have maybe not been as prepared for college and looking at those opportunities. So how do you particularly meet students where they are with like was already said, that sophomore class that was never on campus. So we just brought students back on campus. We started class on yesterday. So we do have students here. So, you have that first year, second year experience and all of those retention issues associated with what didn't happen so well, the lessons we learned from COVID and the experience. But I want to particularly start with how do we address students where they are. I spoke with a student on yesterday and it was entitled, just a conversation. From that conversation I took what he said, college dreams and COVID realities. And he says, as a first generation student, we move on campus and it's kind of like you're bringing your family's hopes and your dreams with you. By you being on campus, it symbolizes so much of what you have worked for and what you've always wanted. College has long been a family dream that was unearthed during COVID, right? So how do we deal with particularly meeting students where they are with, again, those mental health issues that we have definitely found out, particularly when you have first generation marginalized students, about how they did not get so much of that attention, that hands-on instruction, just even that touch and that feel of being there. We looked at particularly how do you then deal with the ideas that we sent them back home to environments that probably weren't conducive to learning, that were not accessible to technology. So we're now really trying to meet all of those ideas with even bringing students back. We're dealing with how do we then separate and divide classes into cohorts because of safety measures. So we're still looking at how do we do the best online instruction, best practices. So meeting the students where they are. We've had our Faculty Institute last week where we've just really discussed all of those issues associated with what did it feel like for you in a new learning experience and what does you think it feels like for our students?
Thank you. You all bring up really good points about how our institutions are integrated within larger communities with other institutions around us. And last week, our panelists talked about welcoming faculty and students back, and they refer to our institutions as ecosystems. Our ecosystems are made up of staff, families, communities around the campuses, the businesses, the employers. So within this context of thinking of our institution as this larger ecosystem, how can we use our collective resiliency, what we've learned over the past year, to meet the students where they are? Santiba, can we start with you, please?
Yes, I think for us, one of the biggest things that we had to think about, like as I alluded to earlier, is our location. So just to give some context, while Bennett is a historically Black college for women in North Carolina, we are literally across the street from the largest land grant public institution in our HBCU nation, and that is North Carolina A&T. But on the other side of us is UNCG Greensboro, again, coming out of the UNC system. So there have definitely been different conversations that are being had about the importance of, getting the vaccine. With us being a private institution, we were able to make it a requirement. But again, our students take classes across campuses. So, you know, some of those Aggies and Spartans will be on our yard and our Bells will be in theirs. So thinking about how that's going to impact us in the long run. And I think another thing that people need to also consider, again, the faculty and staff. So if you don't have the folks in the cafeteria or the library, that's going to be an issue. Or what happens to those professors and instructors that are actually engaging with the students? So that ecosystem is kind of integrated throughout the community, depending on, you know, what you're engaging with and looking at the health status of our students. Because again, as a campus full of women of color, we got to think about the various comorbidities of not only our students, but of the faculty and staff that are there to support them.
Thank you. And Edward, we'll go to you next. You're on mute.
The trigger finger. Sorry about that. So I think, you know, for us, one of the biggest, you know, lessons learned, and particularly of how do we deal with this, is we've increased our partnerships with our sister institutions right here, because I think, you know, looking at a very crucial part of faculty and faculty development has been a main focus of all of the institutions in the Provost collaborative. We talked about, you know, how do we then look at ideas of sharing courses, exchanging faculty. So I think that has been a very a good thing of meeting students where they are because of the exposures. We've had some MOUs only in ink only and not actually operations. So I think giving those students those opportunities to, of course, maybe participate in other learning collaboratives, other resources has been very beneficial. All of those things become even more, again, like what was already said, as a public institution, we cannot require the vaccine. So there is a cultural clash between faculty and students, and even, you know, most of our students come from the St. Louis, Chicago, Detroit area. So those are areas with high rates of the virus already. So there's an angst with their families, the faculty, and you know, how do we have those town halls? You know, we've all kind of zoomed out, but those things have been very essential to those discussions about how do we do this together without making it such a you know, tumultuous experience.
Interesting how collaborations have sprung up despite the physical distance that we're experiencing. Yes, thank you. And Terry?
Yeah, I want to pick up that point about collaboration and partnership has been critical to us moving through recent times. So in my own institution, we're 7 campuses now. We're a large community college. And I think in kind of responding to what my colleagues have said as well, it boils down to 3 things that we've really had to work on: access to learning and all the obstacles and barriers to that. In my own kind of field, digital poverty as well. You know, access to technology is a real lived experience. Access to high-speed broadband is still a surprise for me in the 21st century, that we have communities often divided around lines of race that don't have sufficient access to technology that they need. So I think access to learning has been one. My colleagues picked up on access to services, mental health services particularly, you know, but childcare, food pantries, these are now the new roles of the modern college in our communities. And those things often go unspoken because we focus on the learning, but, you know, our role in the geographies we serve is changing and evolving. And most significantly, that's happening in relation to the crucial role we play in terms of not just providing access to learning, but access to living wage jobs. That's what's bringing people in through the doors, the lived reality of needing an education to bridge a next step to another point in their life.
Thank you. And you brought up a lot of points about access, not only to internet, but there's some questions here in the chat as well as about just the overall economic health and the vaccines, but let's talk a little bit about how each of your institutions are addressing some of the equity issues that have been amplified by the pandemic. It's not only the technology, the wages, it's food insecurity, housing. How are you all? I'm seeing Edward nodding, so I'm going to ask Edward to address this one. How is your institution coping with these issues?
Yes, I was nodding because you're going through that nauseum list that we're as a cabinet, we're meeting almost daily. I think, like someone already said, we didn't have a summer, we didn't have anything because I think it was a continual cycle, particularly when we first move everybody off campus. I think we were working like from sun up to sundown, literally, but how do we then look at that? I think again, in the HBCU world, if it really was not for some of the federal funds, the CARES Act funding, most of our students and even our institution would be in a very tumultuous situation. We've been able to use those funds to support students. Again, many of our students, most of all of our, 80% of our students are Pell eligible, which means they're on financial aid, which means they also depend on work study. They depend on those research assistantships. So we had to find ways to supporting them with those finances. If we didn't have, again, a lot of the federal funds, most of our students would have been in worse situations. Many of our students, now again, meeting them where they are, and how do we bring them back to campus? Many of them had to go back to homes where their parents, required them to help out, right? So that means many of them then took on jobs at Amazon that, is taking all the college students because they offer you $20 an hour and that sounds exciting, right? And so how do you then get them to understand? And I remember when we first went back where you would go to the grocery store as sparingly as you did, and you would see some students with their device, with their phone, trying to, be a cashier. And I'm like, are you in class? And they're like, so how do we then, support students? It has been, again, the graciousness of the government in supporting most of our students. We then have tapped into our alum base. Our alum did a lot of, as soon as we had to get students back home, there were a lot of donations provided. And then we got some partnerships with Spectrum and some other things to help students get, those hotspots and everything. So it really has taught us about resilience.
Thank you. And you brought to mind, and I would like to ask Terry or Santiba to respond to some very concrete things we can do, with the student on their phone at their job. I read a beautiful ACUE reflection about a community college professor who had most of his students were in the manufacturing business, and he found out that their food bank at the school was not open during the factory hours. So he simply offered to get their lists and make sure their groceries were there. And that's how he got them to come to class. And then it also saved them time. So things like that, we can do all of these little things to help our students. Terry or Santiba, either of you, do you have some examples like that you're doing? Thank you, Santiba.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to piggyback on the comment of time commitment that Edward has already brought up as well, where that was one of the big issues that we saw with our students during the pandemic. And I can honestly say I experienced it personally with one of my students definitely logging in during class on her cell phone while she was at work in the drive-through window. So trying to get the students to understand that if you take a class in a virtual environment or an online course, that it could actually mean a greater time commitment than if you were doing that class in person. Because in person, you have a set schedule, you know that you're going to check in 2 to 3 times a week and physically enter a room. But one of the big things that we've pushed moving forward now, because our semester has also started, but we work in mini-mesters. So the first mini-mester is 2 weeks, we decided to keep that virtual. So our students are just coming back this weekend to start their 7-week mini-mester, September 1st. And we decided to go hybrid. So that way we're going to try to reacclimate the students to understanding the time commitment of your coursework. So no, you can't have a job just because your class is online. So by bringing them back in the classroom, at least partly, because like I said, it's hybrid, because we're already anticipating that by mini-semester 3, which will go into the Thanksgiving holiday, we're not going to bring our students back after Thanksgiving. Because again, too many comorbidities, and actually take the pandemic out of the equation. We just got to think about the financial cost. We actually have a strong alumni association coming out of California. So surprisingly, at our small North Carolina institution, there are a lot of California belles. We can't have those California belles flying back and forth after a couple of weeks because financially, it just doesn't make sense. It's kind of actually one of the interesting things that came out of the pandemic, where it's making us reevaluate how we've been running the institution, like the time commitment, and actually explaining to students, yes, this is a 3-credit course, but you probably need to invest X amount of time. And if you have a lab, consider that. And then also the whole idea of, does it make financial sense for students to do some of the things that they're doing? Because similar to Edward, a large percentage of our campus is receiving some type of federal funding, hence the reason why they're working these jobs, and while we can't have them coming back and forth from the holidays. So minus the pandemic, these are still realities that we have to consider and think about moving forward in the academy.
Thank you, Santiba. And then in addition to the economic concerns, there's a lot of questions coming into the Q&A about mental health and how we're supporting. And I know that this is near and dear to your heart, Terry. Would you like to address that, how you're showing caring to not only your students, but your faculty and staff as well?
Yeah, and actually, I think this is about a whole host of issues around those kind of additional student services, not just related to counselling, but I think accessibility needs have seen a bit of an uptick as well. The mental health thing kind of comes to the fore for most people because it's what we see. It's probably the most of the lived experiences. And I think, you know, like other institutions, we've invested in services and counselling. I think as institutions, we're leading the way in kind of removing the stigma around mental health. I think we're making great gains in the higher education space in making it more appropriate to talk about mental health issues for students to kind of seek assistance with mental health issue. But in my own experience of kind of talking to colleagues across a number of institutions, I question whether or not we're making that progress in kind of transparent conversations about mental health issues with our staff and our faculty. And I think equally, you know, as institutions, we invest in kind of providing services to our faculty, to our staff. All our faculty, all our staff have access to kind of free counselling here at Dallas College. So, and I'm sure that's true of other institutions as well. I think it's about the providing the access is one thing. I think it's also incumbent on institutions to have the conversation about where are the pressure points, where are these the origins of issues associated with some of the things we're seeing kind of growing in terms of the mental health space, particularly around anxiety and depression. You know, those are the ones we kind of gravitate to. And you can hear me pausing and hesitating. This is evolving. You know, one of the things that I've seen, we're back. It's our first week of class, and I've had a number of conversations with faculty and staff where they thought this start of this semester was going to be different, and you know, they weren't mentally prepared necessarily for how this fall semester is going to play out already. And already there's an amount of exhaustion. There's excitement, definitely, but there is this kind of sense of how do we deal with the unknown that's going to come our way in the next few weeks.
Carmen, may I just add that when we think about mental health across our institutions, we also have to think about other ways that we can cut back on that exhaustion that Terry spoke of. I know, for example, one of the things that we've done at Bennett College, you know, I serve as the faculty senate president, and I had a meeting with our dean of faculty and our vice president of academic affairs and was like, can we scale back on the meetings? simply having that conversation to say, you know what, we can probably combine, these meetings, or let's scale back to this semester, we're only going to have this meeting twice a month instead of every week. Something small like that is not costing the institution any money. It's probably actually going to save time across the board, because we're going to gather people, will gather via Zoom or Teams, but gather people together to have these conversations, because, as Terry alluded to, a lot of us are zoomed out, and I think the mental fatigue is real. So I think one of the things that we also need to consider as faculty and staff is, what are the small changes that we can do to assist our faculty and staff? Because in order for us to meet the students where they are, we got to make sure we're not pouring from an empty cup ourselves. So just rearranging the meeting schedule, decreasing the amount of time the meetings are, all of these like little small changes can have a big impact. And then one of the things that we also started doing towards this summer, but taking a mindful moment before some of these meetings start. Because a lot of times, we're zooming in, we're zooming out. So how about we just all pause and we literally take like the deep breath together before we dive into whatever we're talking about? Because I do think a lot of times we focus on the students, but we got to remember, if we are here to support them, we got to make sure that we're sound and grounded ourselves. So think about those little things that you can do that's going to impact mental health, be it rearranging meeting times. Let's change the agenda, and maybe that first agenda item needs to be everybody taking a deep breath, or figuring out maybe a common hour where nobody schedules any meetings. So that's going to be that hour where if you just need to take a walk around campus, or shut your laptop for a little while, you can.
Can I add another perspective? Because I think, from an administrative standpoint, and how do you do work-life balance? But I think what has really particularly come out from the administrative idea is more hours, and how do we then develop more time to create new policies as it relates to remote working, attendance, all of those things. And I think, again, if we look at Dr. Campbell's sister institution, Spelman College, just last week, the faculty senate decided that they were going to send a letter out of frustration and anxiety and fear that there were not going to be any more instruction. The president had already said that we moved back to this normalcy. The faculty said, oh, we're not teaching class, right? So the battle between the culture of administration and faculty as how do we then now have to look at new policies? And that becomes even more exhaustion. And particularly now it's in an angst with faculty, and it's an angst with administration. Then it becomes more of a battle between the us and them. And that, I guess, even that pressure and that tension is felt with students. The students are saying, well, the professor said we're not meeting, but the administrator is like, oh, yes, you are. The class is there. So how do we then look at like all of that? Because I think, again, it creates a mental and almost a spiritual war on campuses that we haven't felt for some time on issues as broad as something of this sort.
Thank you. And that is one of the questions we have in the chat, actually, is how do we help administrators and faculty understand where each other is on these issues? And some of these things that you're talking about too go right into my next question, because when you're talking about making meetings shorter and having a time to just take a breath and do some work that you need to get done, and being more intentional about meetings and classroom time, that to me, over this last year, we've been talking a lot about the hardships we've gone through over the last year, but what about the silver linings? I mean, these policy changes, I hope they last past the pandemic. I hope we allow people to take a breath before meetings past the pandemic. I hope that so that these things continue and we get a new perspective. So from your perspective, I think it might be Terry's turn now to start this one off. What are those silver linings, and what are some concrete things we can do to make sure we grab a hold of those and keep those going?
So, and I'm watching the questions in the chat as well. And I think there is we're having a coded conversation about them and us, about administrators and faculty. And I've met few administrators who've not been faculty themselves. In my own case, I'm an administrator now, but spent nearly a decade as a faculty member. And I think one of the things that this set of events has really brought to the fore is the importance of communication between administrators and faculty. And it's something we're all working on. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's something we're all working on. And I think part of it is also our approach to communication. Often those kinds of conversations between administrators and faculty could be construed as kind of about positions and privilege and those kinds of things. I think now we're kind of moving beyond that, because we're all invested in serving our students and our communities. We all see the virtue in doing that. We all recognize that needs to be done. And we're trying to find solutions that work, because to respond to some of those comments, administrators are as exhausted as faculty members. It's exhaustion is plaguing the entire campus community. And so it's incumbent on all of us to come together and talk about what works to reduce that stress, that exhaustion, and most of that is about communication, timely communication. But I think the other thing here as well is one thing that we're all adjusting to is the fact that we have to be agile and nimble in ways we've never been before. Whereas historically, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, we were making decisions that had been debated, discussed, reviewed over years. We now have to make those decisions in possibly days. Because if we don't, that has consequences for institutional management, or it has consequences for the communities we serve. It means saying no to a kind of particular group in our community that we don't want to say no to. So I think it's really about us needing to kind of reframe our conversations, but also kind of be cognizant of a new era of us being agile and nimble to a whole host of needs, most of which we don't know what's coming our way.
I can jump in here because I'm just now getting caught up with the chat, and I want to address some of the concerns in the chat. First of all, I'm probably the newly minted administrator on this call, and some of those administrative responsibilities actually came from the pandemic. So started out as the faculty senate president, but then became this director of academic special initiatives when we had to start to ask the question of what are we going to do to not only move the students forward, but the faculty forward. So to address some of the questions in the chat about whether or not your administration would listen, a lot of this comes back down to Terry's point of communication. Go to your faculty senate president and have that conversation, right? If you want to make these changes with the meetings. I can also say, and it's one of the things that we did have to have a good look in the mirror at ourselves at Bennett College, but we had to remember where the power was, right? So there are some changes that we've made as faculty that we didn't need to go to the administration for. If we want to have a different type of faculty meeting, then we're going to have a different type of faculty meeting. I don't need to ask permission of the VPAA or the president to make it happen. As faculty, we can take it upon ourselves to do it. And one of the silver linings, at least I can say for us at Bennett College that came out of the pandemic, is now we're hashtag Team Bennett, where across the board, we are a unit that's trying to get everybody across the finish line. So on this call, I'm using the terminology of faculty and staff. But once the pandemic hit, we started having monthly meetings of the campus as a whole. So that's when we just come together as Team Bennett. It doesn't matter if you're faculty or staff, because faculty have to figure out how to do these tech-enabled classes, but staff is all the support, the clinical counselor, financial aid, even the admissions office, right? Think about what your admissions office has gone through recruiting students that they could not physically touch. Right, recruiting students where I can't go into that school, church, or fair to talk to. So that's one of the things that we realize, and some of this probably comes from my background as a social psychologist, is we got to work on our identity, right? So what is your identity as your institution? And focus on that and start to bring the message home. Because I will say, being on the other side of the fence now and seeing what administration is like, there's usually a lot more moving pieces that are going on that faculty aren't just privy to. Because, from whether or not the washing machines are working in the dorms, right? As a faculty member, you may not be thinking about whether or not the washing machines are working in the dorms, but if we're about to bring all these students back to campus, we need to make sure those washing machines are working. So one of the things by having that monthly meeting where we all come together, and the meeting's normally led by like the president or the VPAA, is so we can share those concerns. So I don't feel like everything has to be a written up policy that you then got to get approved by the board of trustees. Taking a breath at a meeting, you don't need a policy for that, right? If you decide at how you're running your meeting, if that's what you want to do, so be it. Also in the chat, there was a question about how do you bring people together to do more tech-enabled and virtual things. This is where I have to give a shout out to ACUE. So on our campus, we literally started with the ACUE toolbox of building online courses. So I will say that we haven't gotten to the point where we have fully laid out online courses at Bennett's campus, but it did allow a lot of my colleagues, myself included, to come up to a modern time of being tech-enabled, right? Where we can use all of those wonderful features of Canvas and Zoom and Teams or whatever platform that you're using to make that class more accessible for everyone. And if your campus already have these resources, again, this isn't money, this is time, which goes back, to the point that Terry made earlier. A lot of this is about a time commitment and how we are starting to balance the time. I will say I disagree with Edward, where there's no work-life balance in this. There's a work-life integration. So you're going to have to figure out what that integration is going to be, because there is no balance, right? And at our campus, we had the same response as Terry, where people were like, oh yes, we're going back face to face and it's going to be great. And then when we had our Faculty and Staff Institute, which got moved back to being virtual, which was supposed to be online, it was a bit of a shocker. So here we are again dealing with anxiety with faculty and staff that we need to make sure we get under control so we don't project that to the students. So, in summary, think about, again, those changes that you can make on your own that don't necessarily need a policy or some type of amendment or a vote from the Board of Trustees, and take some of that power back into our own hands. Likewise, in your classroom, you want to take that moment of pause in your class, it's your class, right? So you can make some of those decisions, but we also have to be mindful and provide grace to one another for what's going on in these situations. So before we talk about what the students aren't doing, literally, we had faculty meeting today and 2 faculty were complaining about students' cameras not on. Guess whose camera wasn't on in the meeting? So then I had to say, you can't say my students don't turn on their camera when, sir, your camera's not on. So I think we got to make sure we are extending grace to not only our students, but to ourselves, and finding the ability to make that pause and reclaiming our power as educators and remembering why we're here.
Agree. I think for us, the silver lining has been now we're having comprehensive conversations across the campus. So now we really have, again, those understandings. What is the real definition of persistence? And isn't that much different from retention? And how does all of this impact you as a faculty member? I think, I've always been a very transparent leader. So, okay, if you want to do this, that means you don't have students. And if we don't have students, we don't have you. So having these town halls through this virtual world has helped us hone in on those conversations. One of the things, particularly, I like to do readings and use like book discussions and articles to bring that together and brought to the faculty it's a series of books, but the section of it is getting off the dance floor and on the balcony. And it goes back to what Dr. Campbell was saying. Faculty have not really been able to see all of the other things beyond my content, my class. And so I think, what we've really come to the understanding is, and we're having those conversations is we're all learning together. At this point, the faculty and the student are exchanging roles. A student, and I saw it in there where someone said, what do you do when a student has more tech savviness than the instructor? So, you know, I think what has been the silver lining is we are now all in an academic experience. Everyone is learning at the same time. Some of our students were technology rich because that's where they came from, or they just had these devices, but now having the conversation of now using technology to learn is totally different. And then how do we then give faculty the opportunity to learn? If, again, very seasoned faculty, so, you know, they're kind of technology averse. When I'm, you know, saying, you know, like I sent that and it's in the Zoom link and they're like, where is that? You know, so again, having the idea where we're all learners has really leveled the playing field, where it's no longer, I'm the instructor, you're the learner, we're all learners. And that has been the biggest silver lining for us.
Can I add something, Carmen?
Sure.
I think one of the other thing, and I'm kind of drawn to this from comments by both Santiba and Edward, is one of the things that we had to do was step back as an institution and look at all the information we were giving employees, faculty, and students. And, you know, we realized it was way too much. It wasn't curated appropriately. It was disaggregated, it was disconnected. And one of the things that, one of the pieces I'm most proud of is work I've led over the last year with others, because it takes a village in all these efforts, is really kind of curating what are the key links your faculty need, what are the key links your employees need across the board, and what are the key links for students as well. And I'm seeing the chat and a lot of questions about how do we find, how do we get our students to the right services on our campuses. One of the things that I still continue to do, because we've done the curation work, but are people engaging with it? That's a whole other conversation. But a conversation I had just this week, yesterday actually, with a group of faculty was, you're asking me questions about resources which are readily available to you, and I can tell you where they are. But what about if you took 5-10 minutes? Imagine you were a new student to this institution and you wanted mental health resources, or you wanted emergency aid, or you wanted information about an advisor. Where would you go to find that information? And I think it's, you know, one thing that we can all do, not just faculty, but faculty and academic administrators, is what if we took some time to really put ourselves in the shoes of a new student and look at what our institution offers information-wise, you know, because often the services are there, but we're needing to do the heavy lift of connecting our students and community to the resources that are in our institution. And we can only do that if we're aware of them. It's not enough to just make students aware of them. We have to advocate strongly, ardently for the resources and services that are available for these students, because essentially it's either taxpayers' money or their money that's paying for it. They're entitled to it.
Thank you. Yes, I like that. Ardently, we must support our students. And we're getting a lot of questions about very concrete examples as to how we help our students. I'm wondering if you all can expand with some there's some specific questions about syllabi and getting people to come to class, and then there's broader questions. But I have to point out for a moment that the toolkit that we have on the website does have, like, how do you get your students to have an asset-based mindset when they come to the classroom? How do you assess their readiness? So we have some of that, but I would like to hear from your perspectives. What are some concrete examples you've seen of how to support these students? Thank you, Santiba.
I was waiting on Terry. Did you want to go? Because you're not on mute.
I can. One thing is a really simple question. You know, instructors can ask their students, what can I do to help you succeed in this class? You know, and maybe it's something along those lines. It doesn't necessarily have to be that question. But I think very early on in the course, and I'm encouraging faculty to do this week in the conversations I'm having with them, is just reach out to your students one-to-one, you know, and ask them, what is it that you need from me to help you succeed? Or what is it that I need to know about your life, your circumstances, that might help me support you better during this semester? And I think it's those kinds of engagements that we have very early on, because I think it's important to do these things very early on to build that rapport with our students, that notion of a network for them. Let's see what comes back, see what comes back to you. For some students, for many students, it could be nothing. But for a few, it could be something critical that they've not told anyone before, that they feel is incredibly important to them, and it also makes them feel heard in our institution.
Yeah, Terry actually made the same point that I was going to say, and that's simply ask them. I think a lot of times we spend so much time talking pedagogy of how to get the students to come to class, but nobody actually pauses and asks the student, why haven't you been to class? This generation of student is very candid and usually pretty honest, where they'll tell you where it may simply be your class is boring, or it might be, you know, something deeper of, you know, they have to work to support a parent that's in bad health. But I do think we just need to ask them, and I think that's one of the strong suits of being at a micro college. We get to know our students on a personal level, so we can do things like simply ask a question. Also, looking at some of the questions in the chat, I would highly recommend getting to know your campus. So if you don't have a faculty and staff institute, you might want to just peruse the website. You'll probably will be amazed at some of the resources that are there for your campus. From, you know, clinical counselors. I saw someone asking about who's there to have the conversation with the students about financial decisions. Your financial aid office. There's usually counselors that are assigned to the students. So again, you know, as faculty, we have to get out of our offices. And one of the things that I was able to do as, you know, faculty senate president and things that you might want to think about, invite those people to your faculty meeting. There was a question about accessibility services. You know, our person comes to actually all faculty meetings now, but it started with her just coming to share. So we have a better understanding of what it means when she sends out that accommodation plan and what other resources are out there. Our clinical counselor will come to a meeting and also share, but, you know, peruse your website or, you know, ask some of your folks on campus, but those resources are probably there. And I think the biggest thing that I can say, and it kind of alludes to the point that I made earlier about having the cameras on or off, don't make any assumptions. So, you know, that student may have not come to class because they had to go to work, or maybe that student is actually ill and doesn't want to tell you that, you know, they've contracted coronavirus. You know, depending on where people live, you know, it can be kind of taboo. So, you know, let's not assume that student's camera is not on because they don't want to be a part of what's going on. And lastly, I do want to have another shout out to ACUE, because students still need that connection. And one of the things that I learned from ACUE is the importance of that welcome video. And I'm probably moderately tech savvy here, but what that video did teach me is I can just use my cell phone and literally record a video of me just saying, welcome to my class. And that's going to be even greatly important for those of us who will be teaching hybrid, because there are going to be some students that won't ever get to set foot on our campus right now. So that video is going to be that first interaction they have with me. So other little things like that they have in the toolbox. And then a lot of these lessons of pedagogy and also class assignments like online discussion boards, ACUE already has kind of laid out there for you. So you don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? You just need to decide which tires you want to put on the car so you can just drive this thing. Because the reality is the pandemic is one issue, but the change in higher education, that's going to be here after the pandemic. So we're going to have to be flexible. On our campus, we don't use the term resilient, right? As people of color, I get tired of being told that I need to be resilient. Slavery was a long time ago, right? But what I am is anti-fragile, which means, you know, you can break these parts down, but when they come back together, they tend to come back stronger. And each time I'm hit with some type of adversity, I'm going to come back stronger. I think what's as a team, right, of educators and administrators and instructors, we have to use the pandemic as a time that has broken us down to build us up, to make us stronger, because we got to think what the next century of higher education is going to look like. And in my opinion, that was the real silver lining of the pandemic.
I would concur, because I start all of our faculty meetings with cartoons like the Jetsons. The Jetsons have come full circle. We feel like we're doing telehealth, like all of that. So taking those moments of how do we move beyond transactions to transformation. We move to the whole idea that change happens here. That's our school motto, but we're now moving from transaction. Transaction students come in, they go out, we give them an assessment, we don't know who they are. So how do we then, like you said, just ask? Like, we're moving beyond that. And even with faculty, I think we're just like two ships in the night. There may be somebody next door and you say, hey, you might ask them, how are the kids, but people have gone through so much loss and some other things. So we've gone to those transactions to really to transformation. I think what is really important for us is, again, faculty are on the front line. So again, the partnership with Thurgood Marshall and ACUE has helped us particularly help faculty understand some of those other intricacies that, again, if an administrator on campus starts talking about, it may have a wall of resistance. But again, having a source and an agency that can help us, that has definitely broken down a lot of the barriers, particularly now, the best practice of online instruction, Quality Matters, ACUE, all of those things have helped us to move beyond just those transactions to real transformation. Because again, as Dr. Campbell said, education will never be the same. I think this is our 9/11, right? This is what is going to be the idea. Most families now are saying, do we have to even come back to the brick and mortar, right? So how do we put ourselves in the best situation to keep doing what we love to do?
Thank you. I think I could talk to the three of you for the rest of the afternoon. It's really exciting to see that through the midst of what we've been going through, all of the positive changes and the thoughtfulness and the caring that we're showing towards each other, our students, and how it's going to go beyond this time. Thank you. That was a great way to end. Thank you for your insights today. And now, to round out today's discussion, I'd like to welcome Felice Noodleman and Dr. Jacqueline Jones from the American Association of State Colleges and Universities to give some closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carmen. And what a great conversation all. Thank you. So in the midst of a year where our students, faculty, colleagues, and communities have experienced profound loss and division, and where we continue to grapple with the disruptions and inequities that challenge our institutions and our entire country, we also do see a sense of purpose. ACUE institutions are stewards of place, and with the help of those on the panel and all of the institutions that have been doing this great work, and with the support from ACUE, we can build a more equitable and inclusive path forward. We need to. The stakes are just too high. We know that the year ahead is going to be difficult, and we need to embrace this work. So there were numerous takeaways, too many to name all of them, from this webinar that I hope inspire and motivate all of you. One, meet your students where they are. Understand their lived experience, their true lived experience, and don't shy away from those conversations or addressing those issues. Leadership matters and faculty matter, and we need to bridge that gap. Jacqueline, please jump in and share your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Felice. This conversation has been so enriching. Hearing about all of the silver linings that have come from the pandemic at each of your institutions. And I've appreciated hearing from our panelists as you've shared practical approaches to ensuring that as the fall semester is upon us, that we are ensuring that all of your students are feeling welcomed and ready to engage in this semester, but also recognizing that our students can get exhausted and Zoom fatigue is real, especially in a virtual learning environment. Meeting students where they are is critical to level the playing field for student success. Today, you heard from our panelists practical ways that as faculty members, you can increase your teaching pedagogy, And in many ways, our panelists really underscored the importance of equipping faculty to teach with an asset-based mindset so that students can feel supported as they go through the everyday challenges that they may face as a college student. As our nation grows more diverse, colleges and universities are placing greater emphasis on creating equity-based educational environments where students, especially from racially minoritized backgrounds, can thrive. The changing realities of post-secondary education demand that faculty, academic administrators, and staff are finding ways to meet students where they are, but also meeting one another where you are as you also adjust to the pandemic and how you can live in this new normal and teach with an asset-based approach. It's important that each of you are meeting your students where they are, faculty and staff actively engaging with structures, practices, and policies that produce racial inequality and policies that produce racial inequality in educational outcomes. We thank you so much for coming to this webinar, and we wish you every great success as you begin a brand new academic year.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us today. You'll see a survey link in the chat for you to provide feedback on today's session. We rely on your input to continue to offer the most relevant and engaging content. Please complete the survey so that we may continue to provide you valuable content. And don't forget to register for our third webinar in our Back to School series, Getting Better Prepared for Online and Hybrid Learning, which will take place on Tuesday, September 14th at 3 p.m. Eastern. Thank you all for being here today, and we will end on time. Thank you.